The first of the Four Noble Truths is the truth of suffering. The various philosophical schools of Buddhism interpret the word truth in different ways. For example, there is a fundamental difference between the Prasangika Madhyamaka school and the Shravakayana schools in the way they distinguish ordinary beings from Arya or superior beings. The Shravakayana makes the distinction on the basis of whether or not a person has gained direct intuitive insight into the Four Noble Truths. The Prasangika Madhyamikas do not accept this criterion because they hold that even ordinary beings can have direct intuitive realizations of the Four Noble Truths. However, I will not go into these arguments here because it would complicate my explanation. Instead, we will turn straight away to the meaning of dukkha, or suffering. In this context, dukkha is the ground or basis of painful experience and refers generally to our state of existence as conditioned by karma delusions and afflictive emotions. As Asanga states in the Compendium of Knowledge Abhidharma Samuccaya, the concept of dukkha must embrace both the environment where we live and the individual beings living within it. The three realms of suffering. In order to understand the environment in which unenlightened beings live, we must look briefly at Buddhist cosmology. Point 1. According to the Buddhist teachings, there are three realms of existence: the desire realm, the form realm, and the Buddhist cosmology, formless realm. Point 2. The difficulty here for most of us is how to understand these three realms. In particular, how should we conceive of form realms and formless realms? It is not enough to simply say that Buddha talked about these in He scriptures. That alone is not a sufficient reason for a Buddhist to accept their existence. Perhaps the most helpful approach is to understand these realms in terms of different levels of consciousness. For example, according to Buddhism, the very distinction between enlightened existence and unenlightened existence is made on the basis of the respective levels of consciousness. A person whose mind is undisciplined and untamed is in the state of samsara or suffering, whereas someone whose mind is disciplined and tamed is in the state of nirvana or ultimate peace. We also find that the Buddhist distinction between ordinary and Arya beings is made on the basis of their respective levels of consciousness or realization. Anyone who has gained direct intuitive realization of emptiness or the ultimate nature of reality is said to be an Arya, according to Mahayana, and anyone who has not gained that realization is called an ordinary being. In relation to the three realms, the subtler, the level of consciousness an individual attains, the subtler the realm of existence he can inhabit. For example, if a person's ordinary mode of being is very much within the context of desire and attachment, that is to say that he tends to develop attachment to whatever he perceives, like desirable forms or pleasant sensations and so on, then such attachment to physical objects, thought processes, and sensory experiences leads to a form of existence which is confined within the desire realm, both now and in the future. At the same time, there are people who have transcended attachment to objects of immediate perception and to physical sensations, but who are attached to the inner states of joy or bliss. That type of person creates causes that will lead him or her to future rebirths, where physical existence has a much more refined form. Furthermore, there are those who have transcended attachment not only to physical sensations, but to pleasurable inner sensations of joy and bliss too. They tend more towards a state of equanimity. Their level of consciousness is much subtler than the other two, but they are still attached to a particular mode of being. The grosser levels of their mind can lead to the fourth level of the form realm, while the subtler attachment towards equanimity leads to the formless realms. So this is the way we relate the three realms to levels of consciousness. On the basis of this cosmology, Buddhism talks about the infinite process of the universe coming into being and going through a process of dissolution before again coming into being. This process has to be understood in relation to the three realms of existence. According to the Sarvastivadin Abhidharma literature, 1. The Buddhist discourses on metaphysics and psychology, which serve as a reference in Tibetan Buddhism. It is from the third level of the form realm downwards that the world is subject to the continuous process of arising and dissolution. From the fourth level of the form realm upwards, which includes the formless realm, the world is beyond this process, which we could call the evolution of the physical universe. This infinite process of evolution is very similar to the modern scientific notion of the Big Bang. If the scientific cosmological theory of the Big Bang accepts only one Big Bang as the beginning of everything, then of course that would not fit with basic Buddhist cosmology. In this case, Buddhists would have to bite their nails and come up with some way of explaining how the Big Bang does not contradict the Buddhist idea of the evolutionary process of the universe. However, if the Big Bang theory does not entail only one Big Bang at the beginning but accepts a multiplicity of Big Bangs, then that would correspond very well to the Buddhist understanding of the evolutionary process. The Sarvastivadin Abhidharma also discusses the precise ways in which the universe dissolves at the end of each cycle. When the physical universe is destroyed by fire, it is destroyed only below the first level of the form realm. When it is destroyed by water, it dissolves from the second level of the form realm downwards. When it is destroyed by wind, it is destroyed from the third level of the form realm downwards. In Buddhist cosmology, therefore, the evolution of the physical universe is understood in terms of the four elements of fire, water, wind, and earth. In general, we usually add space to this list, making a total of 5 elements. A complex discussion on the elemental mechanics of dissolution can be found not only in the Abhidharma but also in the Uttaratantra. These explanations seem to be very similar to modern scientific theories. Having said this, what is stated in the Abhidharma literature does not always have to be taken literally. According to the Abhidharma, for example, the structure of the universe is based on the model of a Mount Meru in the center, surrounded by 4 continents. We also find that many of the Abhidharmic descriptions of the size of the sun and moon contradict modern scientific explanations. Given that scientific experiments have proved these claims to be wrong, we will have to accept the conclusion of the scientists on these points. So here, I have outlined very briefly how Buddhism understands the evolution of the physical universe, or in a broad sense, the environment. As for the sentient beings that inhabit these environments, Buddhism accepts many different types. There are beings with bodily forms and beings which are perceived as formless. Even in the world with which we are familiar, there are many beings which are perceptible to our senses, and some which are not, like those of the spirit world, for example. Generally speaking, the Buddhist understanding is that birth as a human being is one of the most ideal forms of existence because it is conducive to practicing Dharma. So compared to human beings, spirits would in fact be considered inferior, because that form of existence is less effective for pursuing the practice of Dharma. Spirits may have certain abilities that are not open to us, like certain powers of precognition or some supernatural powers, but the fact remains that they are part of this world where human beings also live. All beings in this world are under the control of delusion and afflictive emotions. In some sense, one could say that they are actually the products of delusion and afflictive emotions. Lama Tsongkhapa describes very vividly the unenlightened existence of sentient beings in samsara. He uses the analogy of someone being tied up very tightly by the ropes of negative karma delusions, afflictive emotions and thoughts. Encased in this tight net of ego and self-grasping, they are tossed around aimlessly by the currents of fluctuating experiences of suffering and pain. Point 1. This is what samsaric life is like. 3 types of suffering. So now the question is, what is dukkha? What is suffering? Buddhism describes 3 levels or types of suffering. The first is called the suffering of suffering, the second, the suffering of change, and the third is the suffering of conditioning. When we talk about the first type, the suffering of suffering, we are talking in very conventional terms of experiences which we would all identify as suffering. These experiences are painful. In Buddhism, there are 4 main experiences of this type of suffering which are considered to be fundamental to life in samsara: the sufferings of birth, sickness, aging, and death. The significance of recognizing these states as forms of suffering and the importance of this recognition as a catalyst of the spiritual quest is very strongly demonstrated in the Buddha's own life story. According to the story, when he was the young Prince Siddhartha, the Buddha is said to have caught sight of a sick person, an old person, and a dead person being carried away. The impact of seeing this suffering apparently led him to the realization that so long as he was not free of the infinite process of birth, he would always be subject to these other three sufferings. Later, the sight of a spiritual aspirant is supposed to have made the Buddha fully aware that there is a possibility of freedom from this cycle of suffering. So in Buddhism, there is an understanding that so long as we are subject to the process of rebirth, all other forms of suffering are natural consequences of that initial starting point. We could characterize our life as being within the cycle of birth and death, and sandwiched in between these two, as it were, are the various sufferings related to illness and aging. The second level of suffering, the suffering of change, refers to experiences we ordinarily identify as pleasurable. However, in reality, as long as we are in an unenlightened state, all our joyful experiences are tainted and ultimately bring suffering. Why does Buddhism claim that experiences which are apparently pleasurable are ultimately states of suffering? The point is that we perceive them as states of pleasure or joy only because in comparison to painful experiences, they appear as a form of relief. Their pleasurable status is only relative. If they were truly joyful states in themselves, then just as painful experiences increase, the more we indulge in the causes that lead to pain. Likewise, the more we engage in the causes that give rise to pleasurable experience, our pleasure or joy should intensify. But this is not the case. On an everyday level, for example, when you have good food, nice clothes, attractive jewelry, and so on, for a short time you feel really marvelous. Not only do you enjoy a feeling of satisfaction, but when you show your things to others, they share in it too. But then one day passes, 1 week passes, 1 month passes, and the very same object that once gave you such pleasure might simply cause you frustration. That is the nature of things, they change. The same also applies to fame. At the beginning you might think to yourself, "Oh, I'm so happy. Now I have a good name, I'm famous." But after some time it could be that all you feel is frustration and dissatisfaction. The same sort of change can happen in friendships and in sexual relationships. At the beginning you almost go mad with passion, but later that very passion can turn to hatred and aggression, and in the worst cases even lead to murder. So that is the nature of things. If you look carefully, everything beautiful and good, everything that we consider desirable brings us suffering in the end. Finally, we come to the third type of suffering, the suffering of conditioning. This addresses the main question, why is this the nature of things? The answer is because everything that happens in samsara is due to ignorance. Under the influence or control of ignorance, there is no possibility of a permanent state of happiness. Some kind of trouble, some kind of problem always arises. So long as we remain under the power of ignorance, that is our fundamental misapprehension or confusion about the nature of things, then sufferings come one after another like ripples on water. The third level of suffering, therefore, refers to the bare fact of our unenlightened existence, which is under the influence of this fundamental confusion and of the negative karmas to which confusion gives rise. The reason it is called the suffering of conditioning is because this state of existence serves as the basis not only for painful experiences in this life, but also for the causes and conditions of suffering in the future. Dharmakirti's commentary on the Compendium of Valid Cognition Pramanavartika and Aryadeva's 400 verses on the Middle Way, Chatushata Kashastrakarika, both offer a useful way of looking at this third level of suffering and help deepen our understanding of it. Both works lay the emphasis on reflecting upon the subtle level of the transient, impermanent nature of reality. It is important to bear in mind that there are two levels of meaning here. One can understand impermanence in terms of how something arises, stays for a while, and then disappears. This level of impermanence can be understood quite easily. We should add that on this level, the dissolution of something requires a secondary condition, which acts as a catalyst to destroy its continuity. However, there is also a second, more subtle understanding of transience. From this more subtle perspective, the obvious process of change we have just described is merely the effect of a deeper, underlying and dynamic process of change. At a deeper level, everything is changing from moment to moment constantly. This process of momentary change is not due to a secondary condition that arises to destroy something, but rather the very cause that led a thing to arise is also the cause of its destruction. In other words, within the cause of its origin lies the cause of its cessation. Momentariness should thus be understood in two ways. First, in terms of the three moments of existence of any entity. In the first instant it arises. In the second instant it stays. In the third instant, it dissolves. Second, in terms of each instant itself. An instant is not static. As soon as it arises, it moves towards its own cessation. Since everything arises complete from the outset, the birth of things comes together with the seed or potential for their dissolution. In this respect, one could say that their cessation does not depend on any secondary further condition. Therefore, in Buddhism, all phenomena are said to be other-powered. That is, they are under the control of their causes. Once you have developed this understanding of the transient nature of phenomena, you are able to situate the understanding you have of dukkha within that context and reflect upon your life as an individual in this samsaric world. You know that since the world has come into being as a result of its own causes and conditions, it too must be other-powered. In other words, it must be under the control of the causal processes that led to its arising. However, in the context of samsara, the causes that we are referring to here are nothing other than our fundamental confusion or ignorance marigpa in Tibetan, and the delusory states to which confusion gives rise. We know that so long as we are under the domination of this fundamental confusion, there is no room for lasting joy or happiness. Of course, within the three realms there are states which are comparatively more joyful than others. However, so long as we remain within samsara, whether in the form realm, the formless realm, or the desire realm, there is no scope for joy to be lasting. In the final analysis, we are in a state of dukkha. This is the meaning of the third type of suffering, ignorance. The Sanskrit word for ignorance or confusion is avidya, which literally means not knowing. There are several interpretations of what is meant by avidya, according to the different philosophical schools and their various views of the fundamental Buddhist doctrine of anatman or no-self. However, the general meaning that is common to all the schools is an understanding that there lies a fundamental ignorance at the root of our existence. The reason for this is quite simple. We all know from personal experience that what we deeply aspire to gain is happiness, and what we try to avoid is suffering. Yet our actions and our behavior only lead to more suffering and not to the lasting joy and happiness that we seek. This must surely mean that we are operating within the framework of ignorance. This is how we experience the fundamental confusion at the root of our life. One way to reflect on the nature of dukkha, according to the traditional Buddhist teachings, is to reflect on the sufferings endured in each of the 6 realms of the samsaric world system. Point 1. These include the hell realms, the animal realm, the realm of pretas, or hungry ghosts, and so on. For some people, such reflections may spur them to deepen their quest for freedom from suffering. However, for many other people, including myself, it can be more effective to reflect on our own human suffering. Although Buddhism teaches that human life is one of the most positive of all forms of life, since human beings have the potential to gain perfect enlightenment, it is not always that joyful. We are subject to the unavoidable sufferings of birth, death, aging, and sickness. In addition, when one reflects on the fact that life is conditioned and dominated by confusion, and the delusory emotions and thoughts to which confusion gives rise, then for someone like myself, it seems much more effective to recognize this than to think about the sufferings of other realms. As I mentioned before, the Buddhist scriptures describe the causal process through which ignorance gives rise to volitional acts, which in turn give rise to a birth in one of the samsaric worlds, and so on as the 12 links in the chain of dependent origination. On this, Buddha made 3 observations. He said that, because there is this, that ensues. Because this came into being, that came into being. Because there is fundamental ignorance, volitional acts come into being. 1. When commenting upon these 3 statements, Asoenga explains in the Compendium of Knowledge that 3 conditions are necessary for anything to arise, and I think an understanding of these would be useful here. Because there is this that ensues. Asaonga explained that the significance of the first statement is that all phenomena come into being because they have causes. One could say there is an infinite causal chain. It is not as if there were a first cause or a beginning point in time from which everything arose. Asaonga referred to that observation as the condition of the existence of a cause, because this came into being that came into being. When commenting on the second statement, Asaonga introduced what he called the condition of impermanence. The meaning of this is that the mere fact that something exists is not sufficient for it to produce an effect. For something to have the potential to produce an effect, it must itself be subject to causation. In other words, it must come into being itself as a result of other causes. Hence, we have an infinity of causes. So mere existence alone does not give rise to consequences. A cause should not only exist, it should also be impermanent and subject to causation. Because there is fundamental ignorance, volitional acts come into being. Asaonga's comment on this mentions a further qualification that is needed for a cause to produce an effect, which he calls the condition of potentiality. The idea is that it is not sufficient for a cause to exist and to be impermanent for it to produce a particular result. It is not the case that everything can produce everything or anything. There must be some kind of natural correlation between a cause and its effect. For example, because the nature of our life is suffering, we desire happiness, yet out of ignorance, we create more suffering for ourselves, and this is because suffering is the root of our life. The result we obtain thus correlates with its cause. So to summarize, three conditions are necessary for anything to arise. A cause should exist, it should be impermanent, and it should correlate with the effect. In view of this, how should we understand the causal relationship between, say, ignorance and volitional acts? Buddhism pursues a rigorous analysis of causal relationships in general, and the scriptures contain many discussions on the different types of causes and conditions. However, there are principally two types of cause. One is known as the material or substantial cause, and the other as the contributory cause. By material cause, we mean the very stuff that turns into the effect. So we can talk, for example, about the physical continuum of a physical entity. Many other factors are necessary to allow the transition to take place between a cause and its effect, and these are called the contributory causes. Furthermore, there are different ways in which conditions can affect a result. These have more to do with the complex functioning of the mind. The scriptures identify 5 types of condition, such as the objective condition, which refers to the object of perception, the sensory organs that give rise to sensory perception, the immediately preceding condition, which is the earlier continuum of your consciousness, and so on. So you can see that the Buddhist understanding of causation is highly complex. Let us take the example of fire. What would the material cause of fire be? We could say that a potential exists within the fuel that is used to make a fire, which then becomes the fire. In the case of consciousness, the issue is more complex. For example, it is obvious that we need the physical sensory organs for sensory perceptions to take place. Of course, the physical basis of consciousness would also include the nervous system, although in the classic Buddhist scriptures there is hardly any discussion of this, and it is perhaps something that needs to be added to Buddhist theories of epistemology and psychology. However, the substantial cause of consciousness would not be these physical entities. It has to be understood in terms of its own continuum, be it in the form of a potential or propensity or whatever. This is a very difficult topic, but perhaps we can say that the substantial cause of consciousness can be understood as the continuum of the subtle consciousness, although we should be careful not to end up in a position which implies that the material cause of anything is exactly the same as the thing itself. This would be untenable. We cannot maintain the position, for instance, that the substantial causes of sensory perceptions are always sensory perceptions, because sensory consciousnesses are gross levels of consciousness and are contingent on the physical organs of the individual, whereas the continuum should be understood on the level of the subtle consciousness. So perhaps we could say that the substantial causes of consciousness are present in the form of a potential rather than as actual conscious states. Consciousness. When we talk about consciousness or Shespa in Tibetan, we are not talking about a single unitary monolithic entity that is out there. We are referring, of course, to the mental consciousness, which is the sixth consciousness, according to Buddhist psychology. Generally speaking, when we try to investigate our mind through introspection, we find that it tends to be dominated either by discursive thoughts or by feelings and sensations. So let us try to examine how feelings and discursive thoughts occur within the mind. Feelings, of course, can be considered in relation to two different dimensions of reality. We can speak about them purely at the physical level as sensations, but when we try to understand feelings in terms of mental consciousness, the issue is far more complex. And although we naturally accept that there must be connections between the consciousness and the nervous system of the body, we must somehow be able to account for deeper levels of feeling as well, or what we could call tones of experience. I would like to point out that although very little research has been carried out in this area, and despite the fact that what little exists is still at a rudimentary stage, experiments done on meditators point to a phenomenon which may be difficult to account for within the current scientific paradigm. These experiments have shown that without any voluntary physical change in the body and without any physical movement on the part of the individual, a person can affect his or her physiological state simply by using the power of the mind through a focused, single-pointed state. The physiological changes that take place are difficult to explain according to current assumptions about human physiology. There is no doubt that our consciousness and all our experiences are contingent upon our body, so the human mind and the human body are in some sense inextricable. Yet at the same time, I feel that research seems to point to the possibility that the human mind also has a power of its own, which can be enhanced through reflection and meditation or training of the mind. Furthermore, it is well known that there is a growing recognition within modern medicine of the power of the will in the healing process. A person's willpower affects his physiology. How is willpower developed? It can be through thinking something through and discovering the reasonable grounds for one's understanding. It can also be through meditation. In whichever way it is developed, it is now acknowledged that the will can affect physical change. What does this mean? What seems to be accepted scientifically is that all the thoughts that occur in our mind give rise to chemical changes and movements within the brain, which are then expressed in physiological change. But does pure thought lead to such physical effects too? And is it the case that thoughts occur solely as a result of chemical changes within the body or brain? I have asked scientists on several occasions whether it would be possible for the process to begin first with just pure thought, and then secondly, thought processes occur, which give rise to chemical changes, which in turn trigger physiological effects. Most of the time their answers have indicated that since it is assumed that consciousness is contingent upon a physical base, the brain, for instance, every occurrence of thought must necessarily be accompanied or caused by chemical changes in the brain. To me, however, that assumption seems to be based more on prejudice than experimental proof. I therefore think the question is still open, and further research is needed, particularly involving practitioners who engage in profound meditation. The Vajrayana literature contains discussions of the existence of different levels of consciousness, or different subtleties of mind, and the ways in which these correspond to subtle levels of energy. I think these explanations can contribute a great deal to our understanding of the nature of mind and its functions. So as we saw earlier, most of our conscious mind consists either of states related with objects that we have experienced in the past. Recollections of past experiences inform our present consciousness, or it consists of some kind of feeling or sensation. As a result, it is very difficult for us to glimpse the actual nature of consciousness, which is the sheer state of knowing or the luminosity of mind. One technique that we can use in order to do this is sitting meditation, through which we free our mind from thoughts of past experiences and from any form of anticipation of the future. Instead, we abide in the newness of the present, although we cannot really talk of a present consciousness. When you are able to clear away thoughts of the past and the future slowly, you begin to get a sense of the space between the two. You learn to abide in that present moment. In that space, you begin to glimpse what we call emptiness. And if you can remain in that emptiness for longer and longer periods of time, then gradually, the nature of consciousness itself which is the sheer luminosity and natural awareness of mind, will slowly dawn in you. Through repeated practice, this period can be lengthened more and more, so that your awareness of the nature of consciousness becomes clearer and clearer. However, it is important to realize that this experience of the luminosity of mind, of the nature of mind, is not a profound realization in itself. Rebirth in many of the formless realms of samsara is considered to result from abiding in such states of clarity. On the other hand, if we know how to use that initial experience of luminosity as a basis, then we can build on it by complementing our meditation with other practices, and in this way, it will become truly profound. So here I have explained how we can look at the Buddha's teaching on the truth of suffering. Once you have developed this kind of recognition of the dukkha nature of life, you already have some understanding that at the root of our suffering lies a fundamental ignorance. This of course leads us to the second truth, which is the origin of suffering. The truth of the origin of suffering. In the previous chapter, we looked at the fact that we all desire happiness and wish to overcome suffering, and how despite this natural aspiration, we tend to create the conditions for more suffering because we do not know the way to create the causes for happiness. We found that at the root of this situation lies a fundamental confusion, or in Buddhist terminology, a fundamental ignorance. This confusion applies not only to the way things are, but also to the way causes and effects relate to each other. Therefore, in Buddhism, we talk about two types of ignorance, or avidya, ignorance of the laws of causality, specifically of the laws of karma, and ignorance of the ultimate nature of reality. These relate respectively to the two levels of understanding of dependent origination that we outlined in Chapter 1. The first level was an understanding in terms of causal dependence, which dispels our ignorance of the laws of causality. The more profound level was an understanding in terms of the ultimate nature of reality, which dispels our fundamental ignorance. However, this does not mean that ignorance is the only cause of our unenlightened existence. This has, of course, many other derivative causes and conditions, which are technically called kleshas, or afflictive emotions and thoughts. This is a very complex class of emotions and thoughts described in detail in the Abhidharma literature. For example, according to Abhidharma, there are 6 root afflictive emotions or thoughts, out of which arise 20 secondary types of emotions and thoughts. The Abhidharma therefore presents a comprehensive explanation of the whole world of thought and emotion. There is another explanation of the process of being in samsara in the Tantric Vajrayana literature, which details the 80 types of thoughts or concepts which are indicative of our being in an unenlightened state. The Kalachakra literature, which belongs to the Vajrayana class, further identifies the causes of samsaric existence in terms of propensities or natural dispositions. These afflictive emotions and thoughts which arise from our fundamental delusion give rise to volitional actions. So together, delusions and karmic actions are the origins of our suffering. Generally speaking, afflictive emotions and thoughts are defined as those of which the mere occurrence creates immediate disturbance within our mind. They then afflict us from within. Karma, categories of karmic action. If that is the general definition of klesha, what is the definition of karma 1? We should remember to situate karma within the context of the wider Buddhist understanding of the natural laws of causality. Karma is one particular instance of the natural causal laws that operate throughout the universe, where, according to Buddhism, things and events come into being purely as a result of the combination of causes and conditions. Karma, then, is an instance of the general law of causality. What makes karma unique is that it involves intentional action and therefore an agent. The natural causal processes operating in the world cannot be termed karmic, where there is no agent involved. In order for a causal process to be a karmic one, it must involve an individual whose intention would lead to a particular action. It is this specific type of causal mechanism which is known as karma. So within the general field of karmic action, we can talk about 3 different types of action which produce corresponding effects. Actions which produce suffering and pain are generally considered negative or non-virtuous actions. Actions that lead to positive and desirable consequences, such as experiences of joy and happiness, are considered to be positive or virtuous actions. The third category includes actions which lead to experiences of equanimity or neutral feelings and experiences. These are considered to be neutral actions and are neither virtuous nor non-virtuous. In terms of the actual nature of karmic actions themselves, there are two principal types: mental acts, actions that are not necessarily manifested through physical action, and physical acts, which include both bodily and verbal acts. Then, from the point of view of the medium of expression of an action, we distinguish actions of the mind, of speech, and of the body. Furthermore, in the scriptures we also find discussions about karmic actions which are completely virtuous, completely non-virtuous, and those which are a mixture of the two. I feel that for many of us who practice the Dharma, most of our actions may be a mixture of the two. If we analyze a single karmic action, we can see that there are several stages within that event. There is a beginning, which is the stage of the motivation or intention. There is the actual execution of the act. And then there is the culmination or completion of the act. According to the scriptures, the intensity and force of a karmic action vary according to the way each of these stages is carried out. Let us take the example of a negative action. If at the stage of motivation the person has a very strong negative emotion like anger and then acts on an impulse and carries out the action, but immediately afterwards feels deep regret for the action he has committed, all three stages would not be completely fulfilled. Consequently, the action would be less powerful compared to an instance where the person has acted out all stages completely, with a strong motivation, actual execution, and a sense of taking pleasure or satisfaction from the act committed. Similarly, there could be cases where the individual may have a very weak motivation, but circumstances force him or her to actually commit the act. In this case, although a negative act has been committed, it would be even less powerful than in our first example, because a strong motivating force was not present. So depending on the strength of the motivation of the actual act and of the completion the karma produced, will have corresponding degrees of intensity. On the basis of these differences, the scriptures discuss four types of karma: karma which is carried out but not accumulated, karma which is accumulated but not carried out, karma where the act is both carried out and accumulated, and karma where there is an absence of both accumulation and the actual execution of the act. It is important to understand the significance of this point and to appreciate that since there are different stages to every act, karmic actions themselves are composite and their quality can be characterized as the cumulative result of obeisance, each of their composing factors. Once you appreciate this, then whenever you have the opportunity to engage in a positive action as a Dharma practitioner, it is important to ensure that at the initial stage, your positive motivation is very strong and that you have a strong intention to engage in the act. Then while you are actually carrying out the act, you should ensure that you have given it your best and you have put all your effort into making the action successful. Once the action is performed, it is important to ensure that you dedicate the positive karma that you have thereby created towards the well-being of all beings, as well as your own attainment of enlightenment. If you can reinforce that dedication with an understanding of the ultimate nature of reality, it would be even more powerful. Ideally, as Dharma practitioners, we should of course try to avoid engaging in any negative actions at all, but even if we do find ourselves in a situation where we are committing a non-virtuous action, it is important to make sure that at least our motivation is not strong and there is no strong emotion involved. Then even while we are carrying out the action, if we have a strong pang of conscience and a sense of regret or remorse, then of course the negative act will be very weak. Finally, the action should not be followed by any sense of satisfaction. We should not take pleasure in any negative action we have committed, but rather we should feel deep remorse and regret, and immediately afterwards we should purify the negativity if possible. If we can do this, if we can live a way of life where we relate to our positive and negative actions in this way, then we will be able to follow the teachings on the law of karma much more effectively. Although there are many different types of negative action, the Buddhist scriptures summarize them as the 10 negative or 10 non-virtuous actions. There are 3 actions of body, 4 of speech, and 3 of mind. The 3 bodily negative actions are killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct. The 4 negative actions of speech are lying, engaging in divisive speech, using harsh words, and engaging in senseless gossip. And the 3 negative mental actions are covetousness, harboring harmful thoughts and intentions, and holding wrong views. Ideally, a Dharma practitioner should live in such a way that he avoids all these negative actions if possible. And if not, then at least he should refrain from as many as he can. Leading a disciplined life and avoiding negative actions is what Buddhists understand as an ethical way of life. Karma and the person. How does a Buddhist practitioner actually go about trying to lead a moral life? A person's ultimate aspiration is to attain liberation from samsara, to attain spiritual freedom or enlightenment, so one of his or her principal tasks is to gain victory over the kleshas. However, there is no way that a practitioner can directly combat negative emotions and thoughts at the initial stage. So the sensible way to proceed is simply to find a way of containing the expression of the negative actions of our body, speech, and mind. The first step, then, is to guard our body, speech, and mind from engaging in negative actions so that we don't give in to the power and domination of our negative thoughts and emotions. Once you have achieved this first stage, you can proceed to the second stage and tackle the root cause, the fundamental ignorance of which we spoke earlier. At this stage, you are able to counteract the forces of the kleshas directly. Once you can do that, the third stage consists not simply of gaining victory over them, but also of rooting out all the propensities and imprints they have left within the psyche. This is why Aryadeva states in the 400 verses on Madhyamaka that a true spiritual aspirant must first overcome negative behavior, in the middle phase must counter any grasping at self, and in the final stage should overcome all the calm views that bind us within the samsaric realm. 1. As we have already seen, Buddhism explains how both the environment and the sentient beings living in that environment are produced as a result of fundamental ignorance, particularly the karma, which arises from ignorance. However, we should not think that karma produces these things from out of nowhere. This is not the case. Karma is not like an eternal cause. We should realize that in order for karma to operate, and in order for it to have the potential to create its consequences, it must have a basis on which to do so. It follows that there exists a continuum of both the physical and the mental worlds. We can trace the continuum of the physical world to the beginning of a particular universe, and then we can even trace that beginning to empty space. Buddhism accepts the existence of what are known as space particles, and asserts there is a stage of empty space in which the source of the material universe is in some sense contained. In the case of the mental world, we cannot say that the continuum of consciousness in sentient beings is a result of karma. Neither can we say that the unending process of the continuity of both matter and mind results from karma. If this is the case, if the basic continuum is not produced by karma, then where does karma fit in? At what point does karma play a causal role in producing sentient beings and the natural environment in which they live? Perhaps we can say that there is a natural process in the world, and at a certain point, when its evolution has reached a stage where it can affect the experiences of beings, giving rise to either painful experiences of suffering or joyful experiences of happiness. That is the point where karma enters the picture. After all, the karmic process only makes sense in relation to the experience of sentient beings. So if we were to ask whether consciousness is produced by karma or whether sentient beings are produced by karma, it seems the answer should be no. But on the other hand, if we ask whether the human body and the human consciousness are products of karma, then the answer is yes, because both result from virtuous actions. This is because when we talk about the human body and human consciousness, we are referring to a state of existence which is directly related to the painful and pleasurable experiences of an individual. Finally, if we were to ask whether or not our natural instinct to seek happiness and overcome suffering is a product of karma, it seems the answer would again be no. Karma and the natural world. Now, when we turn to the evolution of the physical universe at large, we cannot say that the natural processes of cause and effect are a product of karma. The process of cause and effect in the natural world takes place regardless of karma. Nevertheless, karma would have a role to play in determining the form that the process takes or the direction in which it leads. Here we should mention that from the Buddhist analytical point of view, we distinguish two realms of inquiry. One realm we could call natural, where only the natural process of causal laws operates, and the other is where certain properties emerge contingent on these causal interactions. On account of this distinction, we find that different avenues of reasoning are used when trying to understand the nature of the world or of reality. For example, in Buddhist analysis, we use what we call the four principles. The first is the principle of nature, the fact that things exist and that causes lead to effects. We could almost say that this principle implies an acceptance of natural laws. Then we have the principle of efficacy. This deals with the way things have the capacity to produce certain results according to their nature. The third is the principle of dependence. Given the first two principles, we see there is a natural dependence between things and events, between causes and effects. On the basis of these three principles, Buddhist critical analysis applies various types of reasoning to broaden or deepen our understanding of the natural world. Therefore, the fourth principle we accept is the principle of valid proof. Given this, that must be the case, and given that this should be the case. For a practicing Buddhist, it is important to appreciate these principles of the natural world so that one is in a position to utilize that knowledge to live a life that is in accord with the principles of Dharma. We could therefore say that by living according to the Dharma, we would be applying the principle of valid proof in terms of the way in which we avoid negative actions and enhance virtuous actions. So as I mentioned earlier, the questions we now have to consider are: at what point in the causal process does karma come into the picture? And in what manner does karma interact with the process of the natural causal laws? Perhaps we can refer to our own personal experience in order to answer these questions. Experience shows that certain actions we do in the morning, for example, will have a continuing effect even in the evening. The action will have created a certain state of mind. It will have had an impact upon our emotion and our sense of being, so even though it was committed in the morning, as an event that is finished, its effect still lingers on in our mind. I think the same principle operates with karma and its effects, even in the case of long-term karmic effects. This is how we understand that karma can create effects which are felt even a long time after the act was committed. According to the Buddhist explanation, of course, the impact of karma can be felt over successive lifetimes as well as in our present life. At this point, I feel that unless we complement the general explanation of the karmic process found in the Buddhist literature, one with points from the Vajrayana literature, our understanding will not be complete. The Vajrayana explains that both the physical world and the bodies of living beings are composed of the five elements: earth, water, fire, wind, and space. Space here should be understood in terms of vacuum of empty space, rather than as space in the technical sense of absence of obstruction. The Vajrayana literature discusses these in terms of external elements and internal elements, and shows how they are related to each other at a very profound level. Through understanding this relationship, our insight into the way karma affects the world is a much deeper one. As we discussed earlier, the fact that consciousness exists is a natural fact. Consciousness exists, that is it. Similarly, the continuum of consciousness is also a natural principle. Consciousness maintains its continuity. To this we must add that in Buddhism there is an understanding that consciousness cannot arise from nowhere or without a cause, and at the same time that consciousness cannot be produced from matter. This is not to say that matter cannot affect consciousness. However, the nature of consciousness is sheer luminosity, mere experience. It is the primordial knowing faculty, and therefore it cannot be produced from matter whose nature is different. It follows that since consciousness cannot arise without a cause, and since it cannot arise from a material cause, it must come from a ceaseless continuum. It is on this premise that Buddhism accepts the existence of beginningless former lives. Point 1. We have seen that the origin of suffering lies in both karma and ignorance, but actually ignorance is the principal origin, karma and the emotions. There are differences in the way each school of Buddhism understands the nature of the kleshas, corresponding to their various interpretations of the doctrine of anatman or no-soul theory. For example, certain states of mind and certain thoughts and emotions, which according to the Madhyamaka Svatantrika and Chittamatra schools may be considered non-delusory, are seen as delusory from the point of view of the Madhyamaka Prasangika school. This is a very complex point, of course, and would require a lot of study. The most important thing for us to know is that afflictive emotion is our ultimate enemy and a source of suffering. Once it develops within our mind, it immediately destroys our peace of mind and eventually destroys our health and even our friendships with other people. All negative activities such as killing, bullying, cheating, and so forth stem from afflictive emotion. This therefore is our real enemy. An external enemy may be harmful to you today, but tomorrow could become very helpful, whereas the inner enemy is consistently destructive. Moreover, wherever you live, the inner enemy is always there with you, and that makes it very dangerous. In contrast, we can often keep an external enemy at some kind of distance. In 1959, for example, we escaped from Tibet since escape was a physical possibility. But in the case of this inner enemy, whether I am in Tibet, or in the Patala, or in Dharamsala, or here in London, wherever I go, it follows me. I think the inner enemy is even there in meditation, and even if I visualize a mandala, I may still find this enemy in its very center. So this is the main point we have to realize: the real destroyer of our happiness is always there within us. So what can we do about it? If it is not possible to work on that enemy and to eliminate it, then I think we had better forget the spiritual path and rely on alcohol and sex and other such things to improve our lives. However, if there is a possibility of eliminating the inner enemy, then I think we should take the opportunity of having a human body, human brain, and a good human heart, and combine these strengths to reduce and ultimately uproot it. This is why human life is considered to be so precious, according to the Buddhist teachings, for it alone enables a being to train and transform the mind, mainly by virtue of intelligence and reasoning. Buddhists distinguish between two kinds of emotion. One type is without reason and is just based on prejudice. Hatred is one of these. This sort of emotion will rely on superficial reasons, of course, such as, this person has hurt me terribly. But deep down, if you pursue that reasoning further, you find it does not go very far. Emotions without proper reason are what we call negative emotions. The other kind of emotion, which includes compassion and altruism, is emotion with reason, because through deep investigation you can prove it is good, necessary, and useful. Furthermore, although by nature it is a type of emotion, it is actually in accord with reason and intelligence. In fact, it is by combining our intelligence and emotion that we can change and transform our inner world. So long as the inner enemy is there, and so long as we are under its control, there can be no permanent happiness. Understanding the need to defeat this enemy is true realization, and developing a keen desire to overcome it is the aspiration to seek freedom, technically called renunciation. Therefore, this practice of analyzing our emotions and our inner world is very crucial. The scriptures say that so far as the desire to overcome the first level of suffering is concerned, the suffering of suffering, even animals have it naturally. And so far as the aspiration to free oneself from the second level of suffering is concerned, the suffering of change, this is not something that is unique to the Buddhist path. Many ancient Indian non-Buddhist paths were similar, seeking inner tranquility through samadhi. However, the genuine aspiration to seek complete liberation from samsara can only arise from a recognition of the third level of suffering, the suffering of conditioning, where we realize that so long as we remain under the control of ignorance, we will be subject to suffering, and there will be no room for lasting joy and happiness. It may be said that the recognition of this third level of suffering is unique to the Buddhist path.